The roar of engines cut through the humid Pacific air like a living beast. Beneath the thick haze of smoke and salt water, the sea burned, lit by oil fires and shattered steel. It was June 1944, and what one American pilot did in these waters would soon spread across the Pacific like an electric rumor, a maneuver so low, so reckless, and so devastating that his own commanders called it forbidden. Yet, in just 3 days, it would send 12 Japanese ships to the bottom of the ocean. But to understand how one pilot changed the course of an entire campaign, we have to go back to the chaos, the desperation, and the sheer madness of the Pacific War. By mid-1944, Japan's once unstoppable navy was bleeding. Its carriers were gone, its air power shattered, and its supply lines stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean. Still, Japan refused to surrender. Convoys kept moving, small ships carrying troops, weapons, and food, hoping to feed the empire's fading war machine. And guarding these convoys were destroyers, escort vessels, and a handful of skilled air units waiting for any sign of American aircraft. On the other side of this vast ocean stood the United States Navy and Army Air Forces, pushing closer and closer to Japan's doorstep. Every island taken, every coral strip captured, brought the Americans one step nearer. But each victory came at a cost. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was ferocious, and bombing runs often turned into deadly games of chance. Most American pilots followed strict altitude rules when bombing ships, around 5,000 to 10,000 feet, to avoid the deadly wall flak that rose like a black curtain from the ships below. But one man, one pilot, saw those rules as a death sentence of a different kind. His name was Lieutenant Richard Dick Hastings, a young, wiry man from Oregon with a quiet smile and nerves of iron. Flying with the Navy's VB-19 squadron, Hastings had already seen more chaos than most men could imagine. He'd watched friends disappear into plumes of smoke. He'd limped home with bullet holes in his wings. And by 1944, he developed a feeling, a hunter's instinct, that told him the usual ways of fighting weren't working anymore. Every bombing mission, he'd see the same thing, bombs dropping from high altitude, splashing wide, missing their mark as Japanese ships zigzagged and dodged. Even when the bombs hit, the damage was often light. The enemy had time to react, to turn, to brace. To Hastings, that wasn't war, it was gambling, and he'd grown tired of gambling with men's lives. So, one day, he began thinking differently. What if, instead of dropping bombs from the sky like everyone else, he went down low, dangerously low, so low he could see the faces of the men on deck before he released a payload? It sounded suicidal. Anti-aircraft gunners would tear him apart before he even got close. And yet, Hastings believed the lower he flew, the less time the gunners would have to track him. At 200 feet, the ship's guns couldn't even angle downward far enough to target him directly. It was insane, yes, but it was also brilliant. The plan was simple but lethal. Fly low, skim above the water, approach from the blind side of the ship, and drop the bomb at the last second, so close that it would skip across the waves before slamming into the hull. It wasn't just a bombing run anymore. It was a knife fight. He shared his idea quietly with his squadron mates. Most of them laughed. Some thought he'd lost his mind. But Hastings wasn't joking. He studied maps, practiced his approaches, and waited for the perfect chance to prove it could work. That chance came in June 1944, off the coast of the Philippine Sea, where Japanese convoys were sneaking supplies to the island chains under heavy cloud cover. The Americans had spotted movement, a cluster of ships moving fast, protected by a handful of destroyers and air escorts. The Navy scrambled bombers to intercept, but bad weather scattered the formation. By the time Hastings and his small flight of SBD Dauntless dive bombers found a convoy, they were nearly out of fuel, alone, and deep in enemy territory. Most men would have turned back. Hastings looked down at the convoy, lines of ships stretching across the sea like ants on a trail, and made his decision. He tightened his grip on the stick, glanced once at his bombardier, and dropped altitude. 200 feet, then 150. The world became a blur of sea spray and wind. The Japanese ships began firing, tracers streaking upward, flak bursting in the sky. But Hastings didn't climb. He went lower. The Dauntless screamed toward the nearest freighter. Gunners tried to lock on, but their barrels couldn't track him. In seconds, he was on top of them. He armed his bomb and released. The explosion was instant. A wall of water rose from the ship's side, ripping through steel plating. Flames erupted as Hastings banked away, his aircraft shaking violently from a blast wave. Behind him, smoke rose into the sky, black and thick. The freighter was gone. The radio erupted with shouting. His wingmen couldn't believe what they'd just seen. Against all odds, it had worked. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 3 days, Hastings would fly again and again, each time skimming, so low his propeller tips kicked up ocean spray. Japanese gunners never stood a chance. In those 72 hours, 12 ships, destroyers, transports, and tankers were sent to the depths. And every time, Hastings flew home with bullet holes in his plane, but a grin on his face. Word spread fast. Pilots from other squadrons began whispering about the Oregon kid who broke the rules and somehow lived. His 200-foot runs became legend. The Navy, at first furious, quietly started studying his technique. But behind the heroics was something more complex. Hastings wasn't just brave, he was obsessed. He pushed his men to fly lower, faster, closer to death every time. And some didn't make it back. The story of Hastings isn't just about one pilot's success. It's about the fine line between courage and madness, between defying orders for victory and gambling everything on instinct. And as his daring runs grew bolder and the Japanese convoys began to vanish from the seas, his commanders started asking the question no one wanted to answer. Had Richard Hastings found a key to victory, or had he just been lucky enough not to die yet? Because one more mission was coming, one that would test his theory to the breaking point and change the course of naval aviation forever. The morning of June 25, 1944, dawned gray and thick with mist. The air over the Philippine Sea was heavy, almost suffocating. The ocean below was calm, too calm, and somewhere out there beyond the rolling haze lay another Japanese convoy. It was Hastings' third day of missions, and by now his crew had stopped questioning him. They knew what he was going to do before he even said a word. "Low and close," he muttered, strapping on his oxygen mask though he wouldn't need it. The men around him nodded. No one argued anymore. They just checked their gear and followed his lead. The convoy was spotted around noon, for transports escorted by 2 destroyers and a smaller gunboat. Hastings' flight of 4 SBD Dauntless dive bombers was ordered to hold position until reinforcements arrived. But Hastings had other ideas. Every minute that passed meant another chance for the Japanese ships to slip away or find cover under friendly fighters. He wasn't going to let that happen. He radioed his group, "We're going in." Before anyone could object, Hastings pushed the nose of his Dauntless forward and began descending. Fast. The others cursed but followed. In seconds, the clouds swallowed them, and the world turned into a blur of rain and gray light. At 300 feet, visibility was almost gone. At 200 feet, the ocean was so close it looked like the plane's shadow was skimming across it. And through the mist, shapes began to emerge. Black hulls, white wakes, flashes of light from gunfire. The Japanese were ready this time. The first burst of flak ripped through the air, black puffs exploding around Hastings' formation. Tracers zipped by like fire needles. His co-pilot shouted a warning, but Hastings didn't flinch. He pushed lower, flying so close to the water that his propeller spray created a shimmering trail behind him. He spotted his target, a transport ship hauling fuel and ammunition. Perfect. He came in fast, straight, unwavering. The ship's gunners tried to lock him in their sights, but at that angle, they couldn't get a clean shot. Every second felt stretched, every heartbeat louder than the last. At barely 200 feet, he released the bomb. The explosion hit like thunder. The blast wave rocked the Dauntless, throwing it sideways. The transport's deck vanished in a ball of orange fire. Oil spread across the surface, burning bright as daylight. The other pilots followed suit, dropping their bombs one after another. Within minutes, 2 transports were gone. One split in half, another listing heavily to port. But the destroyers were moving in fast now, their guns thundering. Hastings' radio crackled with shouts as shells burst around them. He turned sharply, aiming for the lead destroyer. The gunners aboard were furious, spraying the sky with fire, trying to swat the Dauntless out of existence. Hastings didn't climb. He dove lower. He came in so close he could see the Japanese sailors running along the deck. At the last second, he pulled up just enough to clear the bow and released. The bomb skipped once, then slammed into the hull just below the bridge. The explosion tore through the ship like a blade. Flames and debris erupted skyward. When the smoke cleared, the destroyer was gone, just pieces scattered across the water. Hastings' voice came over the radio, calm but fierce. "That's 3. The other pilots didn't answer right away. They were too busy dodging gunfire, their hearts hammering, their hands slick with sweat. But one by one, they started calling in hits. By the time the last Dauntless limped home, the Japanese convoy had ceased to exist. 12 ships in 3 days. It sounded impossible. Reports poured in, and at first, Navy Command thought it was exaggerated. Another tale from the front line stretched by adrenaline and fog. But reconnaissance confirmed it. The wrecks were real. The damage was devastating. Hastings had done the unthinkable. And that's when the controversy began. Technically, Hastings had broken multiple direct orders. Standard attack protocols required bombers to maintain safe altitude and avoid low-level passes that exposed them to shipboard fire. What he did was considered reckless endangerment. Even if it worked, his commanding officers were split. Some saw a hero who'd changed naval bombing forever. Others saw a liability who'd gotten lucky and would soon get his men killed. But while the Navy debated, the results spoke for themselves. Analysts began to notice something fascinating. Hastings' method wasn't just effective. It was scientifically sound. At higher altitudes, bombs dropped vertically, losing momentum and accuracy as wind and speed distorted their paths. But at 200 feet, bombs traveled almost horizontally, skimming just above the water's surface before striking the hull like a cannon shot. The time between release and impact was mere seconds, too short for ships to evade. It turned out that the forbidden tactic had an unexpected advantage. Speed neutralized defense. This skip bombing idea was entirely new. The U.S. Army Air Forces had experimented with it earlier in the war, but had been considered too dangerous for widespread use. Hastings, without realizing it, had perfected the maneuver through instinct, not theory. His runs were cleaner, faster, and deadlier because he used smaller, slower aircraft that could hug the waves more precisely than the heavy bombers originally tested for the tactic. Word of his success spread beyond his own carrier group. Other squadrons began testing the method under controlled conditions, and soon entire units were trained for low-altitude attack profiles. The results were shocking. Against moving naval targets, accuracy doubled. Hit probability skyrocketed from around 20% to nearly 60%. The Navy couldn't ignore it anymore. What had begun as one pilot's rebellion turned into a tactical revolution. But Hastings didn't see himself as an innovator or a hero. He was haunted by what he'd seen, by the burning ships, by the faces of the men he'd flown beside who didn't come back. His own wingman, Lieutenant Harris, was shot down during one of the final missions. His plane exploded before it hit the water. Hastings never talked about it again. In interviews after the war, surviving pilots described Hastings as quiet, almost withdrawn. He never bragged, never told stories. When asked how he came up with the idea, he just shrugged and said, "I got tired of missing." He was eventually awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism, but even that recognition came with unease. His official citation mentioned bravery and ingenuity under fire, but carefully avoided referencing the forbidden altitude. Officially, the Navy never endorsed flying that low. Unofficially, they studied every second of his combat footage. In later years, historians would call it Hastings' Law. The idea that sometimes breaking the rules can change the rules. His tactics influenced post-war doctrine for carrier-based bombers, and even the early stages of jet airstrike craft. The Navy learned that precision could sometimes come from proximity, and that courage and innovation often walked the same razor-thin line. Yet through it all, the legend of those 3 days in 1944 kept growing. Some said he sank more than 12 ships. Others swore he flew, so low his wingtips left streaks of salt on the surface. There are even accounts from Japanese survivors who said they'd never seen anything like it. An American bomber coming straight at them, so fast and so low that by the time they fired, it was already too late. To them, it was like watching death itself skim the waves. But Hastings' story was far from over. The very technique that made him unstoppable would soon push him to his final, most dangerous mission, a mission that would decide not just his fate, but the future of every pilot who followed his path. July 2nd, 1944. The Pacific was on fire. In the days following Hastings' legendary strikes, Japanese commanders scrambled to respond. Convoys began sailing only at night, using cloud cover and deceptive routes to evade American patrols. But fuel and supplies were running low, and one last desperate fleet, 8 cargo ships and 3 destroyers, was ordered to run from Mindanao toward the home islands. For the Japanese, this wasn't just another supply run. It was survival. American intelligence picked up faint radio chatter about the convoy's movement, and a strike group was quickly assembled to intercept. Hastings, despite exhaustion and injury to his shoulder from flying through shrapnel, volunteered immediately. His superiors hesitated. Officially, they'd warned him to stop using his low-pass attacks. But unofficially, they knew no one was better suited for this mission. It would be his last one of the campaign. That morning, Hastings' Dauntless was patched with fresh bullet holes, its paint scorched, its fuselage tired. His ground crew begged him to sit it out. "You've already done enough," one mechanic said, wiping oil from his hands. Hastings gave a faint grin. "Not yet." He climbed into the cockpit, pulled the canopy closed, and took off into a pale dawn streaked with gold. For planes followed him. Men who'd flown with him, men who trusted him more than the regulations that tried to hold him back. They climbed through the morning haze until the sea below vanished into gray infinity. Then, through the static of the radio, came a single coded word from reconnaissance. Convoy sighted. It was time. The Japanese ships were hugging the coast of Mindoro, moving fast under the cover of scattered storm clouds. The lead destroyer's radar picked up the American formation just as Hastings dropped out clouds, engines screaming. The surprise was total. Tracer fire erupted instantly. Black bursts of flak filled the air, followed by streaks of red as anti-aircraft guns opened up from every deck. The Americans were still too high to strike, but Hastings didn't hesitate. He dropped like a stone. The altimeter needle spun. 1,000 feet. 500. 300. 200 feet. His bombardier yelled. "Hold it." Hastings barked, his voice calm but sharp. The ocean rushed up at them like a mirror of steel. Gunners below fired wildly, but the Dauntless was already weaving, darting left and right just above the waves. He aimed for the center of the convoy, a massive oil transport flanked by 2 destroyers. Every instinct in his body screamed that this was suicide. He ignored it. The wind roared. Salt spray lashed the canopy, and the smell of burning oil filled the air. Then release. The bomb dropped clean. It hit the water, skipped once, twice, then struck the ship dead center. A heartbeat later, the freighter disappeared in an explosion so vast it tore open the sea itself. The shock wave lifted Hastings' plane into the air like a rag doll. His head slammed against the canopy. Instruments went wild. He could taste blood. His radio crackled with static and shouting. One of his wingmen was hit, spinning out of control. Another managed to score a direct hit on the second freighter. The Japanese destroyers turned in pursuit, spraying fire across the sky. Hastings fought to regain control. The Dauntless bucked and groaned but leveled out. Smoke poured from one wing, and a warning light blinked red on the dash. He didn't care. He turned back toward the convoy. His bombardier screamed, "We're hit. We got to go home." "Not yet," Hastings muttered again, eyes locked on the last destroyer moving to shield the survivors. He came in head-on. The ship's bow guns opened up, tracers slicing past his cockpit. The sea was boiling with fire and metal. Hastings stayed low, dead center, closing the distance faster than the gunners could adjust. "Bomb-armed." The bombardier said weakly. "Hold steady," Hastings whispered. The destroyer loomed ahead, gray steel and chaos. Just before impact range, Hastings pulled up sharply and released. The bomb struck near the bridge. The blast tore through the forward section, ripping the ship in half. Flames swallowed the deck. The Dauntless lurched violently. Flames licked up from its right wing. The controls jammed halfway. Hastings tried to climb, but the engine coughed, sputtered, then failed completely. Smoke filled the cockpit. The radio went dead. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that feels endless. Then, faintly, the bombardier's voice, "Bail out!" Hastings looked down. The sea below was a chaos of burning wrecks, black smoke, and debris. He could see men in the water, Japanese sailors clinging to life amidst the wreckage. And for the first time in 3 days, there were no more ships left to sink. He turned to his bombardier, his voice calm, almost peaceful. "Yeah, it's time." The two men bailed out as the Dauntless spun downward, flames trailing behind it like a comet. It hit the water and vanished in a burst of white spray. Hours later, they were rescued by a passing patrol craft. Hastings was silent the whole way back, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the horizon. When they reached the carrier, the deck crew erupted in cheers. They'd heard the radio reports. For more ships sunk. The total was now 16. 16 ships in less than a week. And somehow he'd survived. That night, Hastings sat alone on the flight deck, looking out at the endless dark sea. He never talked about what went through his mind, but his squadron mates remembered him saying one quiet thing. "It's strange, the closer you fly to death, the more alive you feel." The Navy grounded him after that. Officially, it was for medical recovery. Unofficially, command feared that his men would keep following his example, and they couldn't afford to lose them all trying to copy a legend. Hastings was reassigned to stateside training duty, teaching young pilots how to bomb ships the safe way. But his legend wouldn't stay grounded. Word spread through the fleet and across the Pacific. Every pilot knew the name Dick Hastings, the man who'd flown at wave-top height, who'd stared death in the face and made the sea itself his weapon. His forbidden technique was studied, analyzed, and quietly integrated into official low-level strike doctrines by the end of the war. It would later influence the U.S. Navy's TBF Avenger torpedo tactics and even Cold War-era anti-ship strike patterns. In time, Hastings faded from the headlines. He retired quietly after the war, living on a small farm back in Oregon, surrounded by silence instead of engines. Visitors said he kept an old model of his Dauntless on the mantle, the paint chipped, the wing scarred. When people asked if he'd ever been afraid, he'd smile softly and say, "Every time. That's what kept me alive." He passed away in 1978. The Navy sent a small honor guard to his funeral, and one of his surviving crewmates placed a folded American flag beside his coffin. Inscribed on his gravestone were the words he'd once said to his bombardier after that final mission. "We flew low enough to see the enemy's eyes, and somehow we made a home." Decades later, naval historians still study those 3 days in June 1944. To this day, no single pilot in the Pacific Theater is credited with sinking as many ships in such a short time. His tactics were once forbidden, but they changed the way the Navy fought and proved that sometimes the line between recklessness and genius is drawn only by the men brave enough to cross it. In the end, Lieutenant Richard Dick Hastings didn't just rewrite the rules of bombing. He reminded the world that courage, when guided by instinct and purpose, can make even the impossible possible.